No Jumper, coolest podcast in the world. And today I'm here with my new friend, Gerrick D Kennedy, who wrote this awesome book about NWA, one of the most important rap groups of all time. Probably the most important. Can we settle on that?
Yeah.
Definitely the ones who changed the game the most, who probably, I mean, this is really the story of the biggest change socially, lyrically, sonically that hip hop probably has ever or will ever go through.
Yeah, there's lots of shit to cover, right?
Insane.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's all stacked on top of each other, like the change of the production through Dre and the change of the style of commentary that was even going on. I mean, it's a lot to cover in this book, and I think you did a pretty good job of sort of wrapping it all up into 280 pages or so.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So you want to tell us a little bit about yourself before we even get into the book, your history, where you're coming from, and everything like that?
Yeah, man. Grew up in Cincinnati. Grew up loving journalism. My grandfather got me into it. It wasn't around like high school. I went to a performing arts high school, majored in writing, where I decided, okay, I'm going to do this for a career. Went to Ohio State in Columbus, majored in journalism and theater, started doing a bunch of internships, like just trying to get my name out there as much as possible. And my last internship, I did 6 before I graduated. My last was at the LA Times, where I rose up from, was a Metro reporter, did a little bit of TV reporting, did a little bit of movies, and like I wrote about comic books for a little minute, and then moved over to the music team, where I've been full-time for like 8 years now.
Really?
Yeah.
Comic books.
Comic books.
That's fire, though. I grew up so obsessed with comic books, and I sometimes think about that like, if I was really going to interview people that I was really interested in, that I'd probably be going on my way to interview comic book artists and writers, because I still am weirdly fascinated by just that strange space.
Right, yeah.
That's awesome. But so, yeah, you're kind of like in an interesting place, because like everybody wants to talk about how journalism is dead, print is dying, but you've actually managed to make a career for yourself in this modern time, and you're writing books, which is also supposed to be dead, but yeah, there you go. That's amazing. So what is the path that led you to even being involved with this book in general?
It started about like 3 years ago. I was at Coachella, reporting on the ground. It was a weird year. I was breaking all these stories just off Twitter, and that's what I was, doing that year. Came back from the festival and got an email from a lit agent, who just wanted to have a chat. So we just started talking about just different ideas, and like, would you ever want to pursue a book? And it was like, yeah, of course, at some point one day, but never knew how, never knew if that was even something I could even do. So then we started talking about like hip hop, and like, he was telling me how big of a market it was in terms of like bios, and how there is such a hunger for it from different publishers. And it's like, well, do you have any ideas? We just started going down different eras. And of course we got to, late 80s, early 90s, because that's just such a great moment for hip hop. So the idea started with a book on Cube. We first floated around something on Snoop, but then we got to Cube. We knew Strata Compton was coming out in a couple of months. So it was like, well, what if we explore the idea of doing NWA? And so that's where it started. I had a month to come together with a proposal, which was insane. Really? I'd never written a proposal before. So I'm like on Google, like, how do you write a book proposal? Like literally Googling the shit. Like, what do you do?
Right.
And so came up with what I thought could be an interesting story, which was just on them, because that's something that it wasn't out there yet. And I was very surprised by the fact that there was no book dedicated strictly to NWA.
Really?
So with the proposal, I knew I wanted to tell this story from before they got together to right when Easy died. I wanted it to be super tight, super right on them, because there's other stuff out there that it like gets into Tupac, it gets into that whole thing. And I think that while that's important, I wanted it to be something on them, because that shift that they created in the industry was so massive, but I also feel like it got a little bit ignored. I think people think of that time and you think of Dre, you think of, Cube, you think of them as a solo, thing, but you don't think of them together. Definitely nobody talks about Easy at all. So I wanted something that was specifically tied to them. And with the movie coming out, you obviously have a good chance to say, what's the movie going to leave out? So I got my hands on the script, just straight journalism style. Just got my hands on the script, read the script.
Were you on Pirate Bay or something?
No, I was not on Pirate Bay. I actually had a connect that was working for the studio, and he slid it to me on the low.
Wow, there you go.
Which I should not out him on this.
No, that's real. That's real journalism right there.
But so I got my hands on it, so I knew what they were leaving out. Well, I didn't at the time because there was a lot of shit in the script that they then cut.
Right. Yeah.
So then it ended up being I actually broke a story from that because the Dean Barnes situation.
Oh, so you're the one who exposed the fact that was recorded and not used.
Was me.
Wow. Okay, I didn't realize that. That's really interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So it was in there, and so knowing that, sitting on that, it was like I wasn't trying to out myself as like working on this book because at that point I hadn't approached any of the guys yet. So I really struggled with, was I going to tell the D Barnes story? But it was too important not to. So
Right.
that's the other part of it. You had to say it. So
Yeah. Did you, so for the record, for people who don't know, basically there was an assault case that Dr. Dre was involved with back in the early days of NWA. She was a host on, do you remember the show?
It was like it wasn't Body and Soul. That was the group that she was in. It was like Pump It Up. That's
Right.
what it was called.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
And so Dr. Dre, I mean, it's pretty crazy because I'd always heard those stories of like, oh, Dr. Dre had assault cases, this kind of thing. But then when you actually read it in your book, it's like, oh, this was not just some little slap on the cheek or anything. This was like a real deal, like beat the shit out of her in front of a lot of people at a party.
Yeah.
Which is crazy. That's like, I feel like
it was really horrific.
And then it was completely left out of the
Right.
of the NWA movie, which is
Right.
kind of strange. And a
It
lot of
was
people
very
took issue with it.
And yeah, I really didn't like that they did that. I mean, I thought it did them a disservice because it wasn't something where this was something that happened in his personal life, which I could argue with you wanting to leave out.
Right.
This was directly tied to the group. It was directly tied to, at that point, not even really a for real beef with Cube yet, but it then launched a full-on thing. So I just think it should have stayed.
And she had basically like dissed them publicly in their perspective at that time. Like
In their perspective, right?
Yeah.
But if you go back and watch it, it wasn't. It was like it was out of her control. It was, Cube, had a little sneak diss
Right.
that he had in there, and they just tacked it on to the end.
Yeah, I mean, for somebody who's in any way concerned with social justice, I mean, reporting on NWA is a more dicey task than probably a lot of people would have assumed because a lot of, you listen to the hits, you listen to Fuck the Police, we're all used to Fuck the Police, we're used to the songs that made their way to radio, but a lot of the deeper album cuts, there's some really insanely bad behavior being
Right.
talked about. Like
Yeah.
when you there's one lyric that, and I love Eazy. I cried when he died when I was a little fucking kid in elementary school and stuff because I was just such a rap nerd even then. But like there's a lyric that I think you pinpointed where he's talking about basically a bank robbery where then, he goes to basically rape one of the cashiers and then it turns out that she has a penis. So he shoots her in the penis.
Yeah.
It's hard to think of anything really in modern media that's as grotesque as that. So, from your perspective, like, was it hard to sort of make the decision to tackle a lot of that stuff? Because obviously it would be easier for the group's legacy to just look away from that and be like, oh, that's a sign of the times. But it was a lot worse than a lot of the other rap music at the time in terms of being problematic. It
actually ended up being a really easy decision just because you can't shy away from any of it. If this was something I was that I wasn't going to be as critical on everything because I am reporting it. So there are moments where it's hard to ignore certain things. There's hard to ignore certain songs where it's like, all right, you have to say something else or give some kind of context as to why maybe they're talking the way that they're talking and things like that. And so, it really came with the reporting of like seeing, this was the mind frame. Like they weren't actively thinking about this. Like MC Ren wasn't like really trying to like sleep with 14-year-olds. But I mean, he
did say something about that.
Just don't bite it.
Oh, but he says something specifically about that?
She was 14.
Oh my God, that's terrifying. Things have changed a lot.
Yeah, so there was a lot of the lyrics that's like, it does make your skin crawl a little bit. But you understood, at least I understood the shock value of what they were trying to do. And this is why. And, they were talking the way that people around them were speaking. So a lot of it is unsavory, but it was something where I wasn't ever trying to take away from the legacy or take away from what they were doing or what they had done. So you have to just say it. I mean, it happened, so I wrote it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think another interesting thing that I got from the book that I always sort of wanted to know more about was just kind of how Dr. Dre made the transition from like world-class wrecking crew, wearing makeup and like these sequin outfits and stuff like that, which Eazy-E like famously taunted the shit out of him for. But like how that transition actually happened, like let's just take that, because that's kind of what I'm really interested in with you writing the book, is like what your research process was like something like World Class Wrecking Crew, not terribly well documented in comparison to NWA. Like, how did you specifically go out and like learn about the history of how that happened? Like, what were the tactics?
You're giving me these flashbacks of like sitting at the computer for 13, 14, 15 hours a day for probably a year and a half. Tracking down every song I could, every home video I could, every article I could. I probably read every single thing ever written about NWA. And surprisingly, there's a lot out there. There's a lot of forums that keep, especially like World Class Wrecking Crew and a lot of, the disco that was coming out and things like that was coming out of LA at the time. There's a lot of that that's still alive on forums and stuff. So I was able to get my hands on a lot of the music.
That's good to know that there's disco historians out there.
There's a lot of them out there. And even like his old mixes that he was doing, like at the Rhodium for Steve Yano, that, they were playing on K-Day. Like you can find some of that. It's hard to find, but you can find it. So it's there. So that part was really cool. I actually... honestly, of everything about the book, the research was probably my favorite part. It was the hardest. I mean, talking to people, it's something that I do every single day. So the interview part wasn't as much of a challenge. Getting people to say yes was the challenge, but the research part, because that's something you don't really get to spend that much time to in a story. If I'm doing a feature on, an artist, I might be able to spend a day or two, and then you got something together, and you're going to come back around to it when you're writing the piece. But to spend, 13, 14 months straight, just research, nothing else. I was doing interviews, but it was really just research and consuming everything that was out there, every single thing. It was insane to like be able to absorb all this and then try to find a storyline. So I had the storyboard at the house, trying to track all this stuff and keep it all together. And going through, especially with the older stuff, a really good book is actually, Lonzo, who was in the World Class Wrecking Crew. He wrote his own book.
Really? Okay.
He revised his own history the same way they did for Straight Outta Compton, but whatever. Okay. So it was a good resource to have where I was able to at least verify some of the things and tracking down some of those people from that time. Talking to the guy who ran Skateland, where they did their first, performances at, but also a World Class Wrecking Crew, played opening day, those were good resources to have, and like being able to go through and then them sending you pictures and you'd be able to like pull together a story, with all of these different resources you had.
I feel like with what you do in terms of writing for the LA Times, that you must kind of constantly feel like you're in that position where you'd like to look into something for an extra couple of days, but the news cycle doesn't really allow for it.
Not always, yeah.
Was that like the real gratifying part about doing the book, is that you're in a position where like, MC Ren's book is the kind of thing that, that's deep. I'm sure there's really, really interesting stuff in there, but unless you're writing a book, it's kind of like that is probably not going to serve you well for writing more short form stuff for the paper or whatever.
Exactly, yeah. You can't always take the time to read an entire book if you're doing, an article.
Right.
So it was really good to be able to sit and breathe and really take all this information in, because it was a ton. It was a ton. My favorite about it, though, when I was going through a lot of it, was like seeing what rap journalism was at the time. Like that, man, I mean, just the level of access, you just don't get that anymore. You don't see any of that, where these writers were spending 2 weeks with these guys. There's this really great, if you have time, there's a Spin cover story. It's called like, I think it's like Niggas for Life or something like that. They were like making a play on the album, but it was like they went to dinner with the guys and Cube had just left. And this is really great. It's like a 6-page thing, but then you have like Cube's response to everything, like on the money stuff and everything. And there's one article, and they had taken the time to get all sides of it. It wasn't just, we're rushing this out, and then you have a response that happens now because there's all these deadlines and stuff. And, so just to see the level of access that was happening, and like, especially Eazy, who was very savvy when it came to the press.
Right.
It was really cool to see that. And like, remember that it was so different back then.
Eazy's one of the most fascinating characters in the book because he, you know, basically was the star, at least the start of the biggest rap group in the history of rap music. And then by the time he passed away, because of the fact that it was AIDS and the public didn't really know about AIDS, and combined, I think, with the fact that his later works were sort of like cartoonish, and it changed a lot from sort of the really focused intent of how NWA started. And even as a kid, I remember listening to Eazy-E and just slowly being like, whoa, like the newer albums are just weird. Like, you know, but in a lot of ways, he's really like the most under-celebrated in comparison to his influence person in rap music, who died really not at the peak of his career, but close to it. And he's just not celebrated in the same breath as somebody like Tupac or Biggie.
Yeah. I mean, it became a punchline. I think that part was probably the most destructive to the legacy. For a long time, you know, people, they're either joking about AIDS or I mean, you know, you go back and there's even like there's a skit on like Doggy Style that like still makes me cringe, like thinking about it, where it was like they didn't know yet, but that was already the joke, was like he was fucking so much he's probably gonna catch something, you know, right? And like, and so then it ends up happening, you know. But just to see how he was written about, you know, and just the shift of everything, and he was, you know, he was very comical in terms of like showing up in a straitjacket or mask and all these different things. It was always shock value with him, but I think when the tide changed, he was then looked at as like, oh, well, you just are like this character, right? Like almost the same way like Flavor Flav was looked at for a while, but he fully embraced it. But Eazy didn't get the chance to try to figure out how to embrace it, or
and Eazy was the realest one out of the people in the group. You know, you kind of have dudes in the group are on like a spectrum from like super real to really not part of that, you know, the street world at all. And Eazy was probably the most legitimate like crack dealer. But then he also was the savviest one who realized, oh, like I can play up this part of my image. Most of my fans now are white, or at least detached from, you know, the ghetto, and they're not going to know that these things I'm saying are totally crazy. And that really ended up kind of becoming his undoing over time, as you had somebody like Snoop, who maybe wasn't being as vulgar or graphic, but he seemed more believable.
Right.
Yeah. It's a weird transition how that happened. And then Eazy just in general, like I don't know, it's like was there anything in particular that stood out about reporting on his story? Like, because he has a bunch of surviving relatives in Los Angeles and stuff too. Was that interesting?
It was. I mean, on one end of it, it's really sad to kind of see how just how bit of a mess everything is in terms of his estate, and how, you know, the kids really don't have any piece of it. You know, I had a really long meeting with two of his daughters and ex-girlfriend, and it was wild to hear these stories that, like, you know, they're going around and they're seeing like all this shit with Eazy's face on it, and like they can't even get like a box of merch sent to them. Right. Like they have no communication with Tamika. And, you know, the same as if you talk to Little Eazy, you know, who we went back and forth and stuff like that. And a lot of it is like they feel like the legacy has like not been protected at all, and that they don't have any say in anything. It's really sad. You know, that's why I wanted to start the book with the hologram. Right. You know, because that was a part of Eazy Now that had fascinated me so much, that we had seen this happen with Tupac, we had seen this happen with Michael. I know there's a lot of opinions about holograms. I have my own. I don't really like them, right? So I think have you seen it in real life? Okay. I was there, so it was like it makes me uncomfortable. I just feel like you should just let the dead rest.
It's like reanimating a corpse,
or just give me like a video. Like I don't know if I want to see
some Weekend at Bernie's type shit.
It's kind of weird, right? So, you know, I remember, you know, being at Rock the Bells, not knowing that it was going to be the last year Rock the Bells. And the selling point about this hologram was like, well, it's Eazy's kids. You know, the face is going to be the daughter, the body is going to be this one, and then the voice is this. So I was like, oh, well, it's like this weird, you know, collage of his kids. So like, obviously, you know, they've had a part in this and things. But, you know, then you talk to them and they're like, yeah, they threw us $200 and that was it. Really? And a couple tickets to the show. And you're like, what? You know, so even then, even trying to honor their father, they're still feeling like they're getting dicked around and played around. So it was a strange thing where, you know, especially if you talk to EB, it's like his youngest daughter, and she's very much like, well, he was murdered, and they're trying to make a documentary about it, and talking to all these different people, and I don't believe Easy was murdered. I think Easy died of AIDS.
Right. But there's so much uncertainty with his friends and family, right?
Absolutely. And so I understood that. I respect that, but knowing that there is just this idea that no one there has any piece of that, and it's really sad. It's just really sad, and you start to think about like, damn, like really toward the end of it, like this guy was so much of a joke that it ended up being like his whole label just kind of went down. Like everything just was gone. Like he was the man that held it all together. As much as people always wanted to point to the Jerry Heller stuff, it was like Easy was the guy.
Right.
He really was. And we saw that when he died, and we saw what all of it became.
And I think, it was very much a time period where as soon as he was set apart from Dre's production, that really kind of like, because he was definitely a character, an enjoyable character, a person who people loved and everything. But from a music standpoint, he definitely was not a musician. He wasn't really even a rapper. Yeah. So then once he didn't have that to go on, like, he was the kind of person who was so great when he had Cube and Dre and everybody like sort of in his corner. But then as soon as he was left without that, doing his own thing, it just slowly started to crumble.
Yeah. That was kind of sad to see.
That's crazy. Yeah, I think that's probably one of the most interesting things about like the process of creating the Chronic is just how Dre really went in and said like, I'm going to revolutionize production and really like change rap. Which at that point, when you listen to Straight Outta Compton or like Fuck the Police or something, it's very much like the production, you could see how the production hadn't come around yet to where it was at on the Chronic, and the Chronic was just so much more of a fitting sound for what would then become California rap. Is that like, are you like fluent in production in a way that it made you able to really understand that? Because I'm not, so I'm just kind of listening to it and like getting the vibe of it, but I've never produced or like played instruments and stuff like that. Was that the kind of thing that you were really interested in the research?
I was, especially seeing the change, and also being able to go back and really look at Niggas for Life, which is such a superior album. When you really sit and listen to it, every single moment of it, from the production, everything, it's really on, and it's like you can really see that Dre, that was the album that he came into his own. Yes, the Chronic is a masterpiece, but I think of that album even more, where it really feels like a cohesive body. Straight Outta Compton, it's a little disjointed. You can even hear kind of moments of like songs being stitched together almost. But it felt like that was the one where he really got it, and obviously Chronic is just smoother. I personally think Doggy Style is the better album than Chronic.
Doggy Style too, man. Yeah, they're both so. Just banging that stuff lately. It's just been so great.
Right? It's insane. Yeah, still.
There's that groove, like, man, I'm listening to too much SoundCloud rap, and you just throw on the Chronic, and you're like, oh man, it's just a great feel to that. Yeah. And I was saying off camera before, but like that's very much like the music that I grew up around. I think I started listening to rap in like 91, 92, so that was the background audio. But it never really stood out to me that like. I never had a real understanding. I think that's probably like the main thing I got from this book was like just an understanding of the climate that created that sound on the Chronic and Doggy Style and everything. Because like, Fuck the Police was already like old school rap by like 91. It was, yeah. It just sounded very dated in comparison to what they ended up doing a little bit more down the road. Yeah, I think the other crazy thing about this book that really stood out to me is just that understanding of where rap music comes from, because a lot of things like the fact that the group was kind of put together, that they weren't necessarily best friends, the fact that Easy wasn't even writing his own raps, and that Dre, I was so surprised that Dre even early on was basically doing one line at a time punch-ins with him. Yeah. Like that's serious shit that you don't think about dudes doing punching in per bar. That's like a very modern thing for rappers. The fact that they were doing that at that time, but how does that shape your perspective of like modern rap, where like a lot of these things like writing your own lyrics and stuff are like held to be the sign of being like a real rapper?
It's hard because you feel almost like you can't throw shade at some of the guys because you think of, an album like Chronic or Doggy Style or Straight Outta Compton or We Want Easy, these pivotal albums, and those were collaborative efforts. They were all writing together. They were all working on the songs together. So it's difficult to be like, well, yeah, these motherfuckers ain't really writing his own stuff. But it was like they weren't either. Dre wasn't either. Dre wasn't writing his own raps always. Cube was writing for this person. DOC was writing for this person. MC Ren was writing for that. They were all working with each other. And I think there's something great about that for sure. Obviously, authenticity is key in this genre and always will be. You know, but I don't necessarily subscribe to that belief that if a person's not writing every single thing, then they can't be authentic. So, and I'm only saying that because of the fact that I came up on a time where it was a lot of collaboration. There was a time where there was a lot of ghostwriting too. Not that that's gone away anytime, but like I think they were more open about the collaboration then than they are now, for sure.
Oh, for sure.
You know, you hear some of these stories of like, well, I wrote this or I wrote this, and it's like, oh, you did? I knew you was on that song because you don't have no credit on that.
Yeah, the Post Malone Rockstar song, it just comes out that like Joey Badass and T-Pain.
Yeah.
That they wrote, or no, Flo Rida was it?
No, I think it was T-Pain. I think it was T-Pain.
That was a shocking revelation.
Like insane though, right?
I want to know how that all worked out with Joey Badass and T-Pain just kicking it, writing songs. But I mean, you hear that from labels too, where like sometimes the label would be like, yeah, you know, this artist is very open to just taking choruses or taking flows, like that they have guys write for them or whatever. Or so
passed around,
right, and they just keep it super low key, and I mean, that's the surprising thing about the fucking Post Malone Rockstar expose is just the fact that we even found out so early on.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. What is your memory of NWA like as a kid? Like how old were you when you first became aware of them and stuff?
Oh gosh, I was like 4 or 5. Okay. My brother,
how old are you?
I'm 30. My brother introduced me to hip hop.
I'm 34, so I'm feeling old now. Damn.
My brother introduced me to hip hop, and it was NWA, Jay-Z, Nas, UGK. That's what we were playing. You know, in the bedroom. My mom wasn't around. You know, because it was like you couldn't listen to any of that kind of music. And so when I was young, the shit really felt like noise to me because it was like Nas had a groove that I could follow. Right. You know, I can hear the stories. I could hear, you know, the storytelling with the J or, you know, with Nas and like UGK, everything. It all just slaps. So, you know, you're just always a little kid, like bopping along to it. You know, NWA, it just really just felt like a bunch of motherfuckers yelling at me. And so I never really got into it until I got in like middle school and like, cause I loved Ice Cube. Like once we started playing like Ice Cube by itself and like Dre, you know, Snoop, like that was like the kind of stuff that I loved. And I think a lot of it was having a bounce to it, like, you know, the beats. And so once I then started listening to the lyrics, I started attaching myself a little bit more to it. You know, growing up in the hood of Cincinnati, just like always feeling like angry because it was like, you know, when I went to high school, that was the first time I was around all different colors. You know, I had gone to schools all my life and we were all poor from the hood. So it was like you're seeing the same people, but you're like going to high school and it's like I'm seeing freshmen with like cars and I'm like, I don't understand this. Like I'm on the bus and like barely have money for lunch every single day. And so it was like once you start seeing different people from walks of life and I'm going home, you know, to a single mom and I'm watching her work so hard. So it's like, oh, she's working this hard. Like, why don't we have more? You know, and then you just start looking at circumstances and like here was music that was talking about that. Yeah. So I felt like I had something to attach myself to.
Yeah, that moment when you're a kid and you finally realize like what your socioeconomic status is. Like I had a friend who lived in a trailer park. I lived in an okay house. My friend lived in a trailer park. I remember the day that I saw his mom and my mom talking, and it was like I was probably 9, and it just like stood out to me like, whoa, my mom is a lot smarter than her. Like you know, and not in a bad way, but it was just like that was sort of when I began to become aware of what my place in the world in that regard was. That's such a strange thing to go through. You know, there's something about NWA too that kind of, when I was a kid, I remember thinking of NWA and Public Enemy as being so linked. And this book kind of makes that connection more literal, but there's a sort of like a feeling of like I'm being yelled at with both of them that sort of was like dissolved away with the Chronic and stuff, where everything started to get a little more smoothed out. Yeah. And that's kind of like a really interesting connection there too, that when Ice Cube left NWA, he went off and did his thing with Public Enemy, and that sort of shaped the creation of his early albums and stuff. I wasn't able to make that connection as a kid because I didn't understand that Public Enemy were New York and that NWA were the West Coast, and there was just very different worlds. Did you run? I know at the end of the book you said that you ran into a lot of roadblocks in terms of trying to get interviews and stuff. What was that process like? Because obviously, like, you know, somebody like Dr. Dre is probably really not looking to talk to anybody. Yeah. What was that like?
It was really hard, man. You know, it started with wanting to get Q because he's my favorite. And at the time, he was going to like Barbershop 3 was coming out. He was about to play Coachella. They were about to get the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, so it was like, oh, I got a chance to talk to him about other stuff, and I can slide in some interview questions. So I was like, that could be like a way to do it. But we went back and forth for a while. Had the interview, didn't go the way that I would have liked it to.
Why, he didn't want to do the old stuff?
No, he's a very intimidating person to interview. You know what I mean? Like, he came in, like, didn't take the shades off. Like, at one point, I think I tried to make a joke, and it was like, motherfucker, didn't think it was funny. And he's like looking at me. He's like, we're like in this restaurant, like super crowded. And he was just tired. Like, he's like, I got this and this and this and this. Like, ask me a question. So, it just felt a little bit more standoffish. We came back around and had another interview, and it was much better. But from there, I thought, okay, well, if I've got Cube, this might make it easier for the other guys. MC Ren, we went back and forth for probably a year and a half before he finally was like, I'm just tired of talking about this shit. He was feeling left out of stuff in terms of, the way the movie went down, the way Rock and Roll Hall of Fame went down. He was feeling very disenfranchised by all of it. So he just was like, whatever, I'm done with it. Yella was never in the country. Yella stayed booked, and it was really interesting. Like, one day it was like, went back and was like, okay, you do it this week. And he's like, oh no, he's in Ibiza for a show. And I'm like, who in Ibiza is listening to DJ Yella?
Right.
Like, spin, like, oh. But then you think about it, it's like the movie like did open this huge door for a lot of people to like love NWA again, and like it came back into fold. The person I chased the longest was DLC, because he goes back and forth with how he feels about Dre. And so, one day I was doing some other stuff, working on the book, and it was like, yo, can you do this right now? And I was like, all right. So he got on the phone and he's like, ask me whatever you want to ask me about this group, and I'm not talking about it again. And so he sat there and he answered every single question. I mean, we talked for hours and he went over everything, and it was like crazy to me. Like, when I wasn't even prepared for it, but you also have to like stay ready, because I'm writing the book at this point, so I know certain things that I want to like try to cover that like the research couldn't get to, because that led me into how I wanted to reach out to certain people. Right. Was like there were certain holes that I had that I wanted to fill in that like the research or secondhand interviews just didn't give me. So I used that to guide me with trying to reach out to folks. But it was really difficult because Dre, a lot of folks still, people were scared. Honestly, I ran into some of that. People were really upset about their portrayals of the film, but also if they were left out of the film, I tried to use that to like my advantage. Like, oh hey, like I felt like you might have wanted to know that there was a scene that you had a line or two, and then they cut it. So like that helped me with like a couple people, like, because they were like, oh no, Dre said that there wasn't time, and I'm like, well actually nah, there was a whole scene where it happened like this. So it did help me a little bit, but there was some folks that just, it was like nope, and it stayed a no. Yeah. Stayed a no, still a no. And
that's crazy.
The book is out already.
Yeah. Have you gotten a reaction from anybody who's kind of close to the situation?
Funny enough, I have not yet.
Really?
I have not yet.
That's still pretty new, right?
Yeah, it's still pretty new. Everybody has it. Cube was like really excited about it. So it was really great, because I think at that point it had been announced that the book was happening. Mm-hmm. And so now that he knew, and we had already had an interview before, and he's like, okay, I see where this guy is coming from. And so the second interview was like, look, there's stuff that like I've never read about you that like I'm just really interested in. Like, I wanted to know, like, where were you at when the riots happened? Where were you at when the Rodney King video came out? These things that made you so angry, and then you put it into the music. Like, where were you actually at when it happened? Mm-hmm. And so hearing those stories where it's like crazy to hear, like Cube like talking about it, and he's like, nobody ever really asked me like this, or like talking about the Nation of Islam and like what it felt like to be attacked for like your religious belief, because that's all it actually boiled down to. Mm-hmm. And so it was interesting to get that perspective now, and to ask him in a way that he's always felt when he's asked questions that it's very combative. And so he even said that he was like, it takes a while for me to warm up, because I'm so used to people coming at me with everything that nobody's ever really asking me how I feel about something.
Yeah. And, that's one thing that you really, if you're someone who's somewhat knowledgeable or at least passionate about rap music, that's like the kind of vibe that you get with a lot of interviews that you do is like, oh, like these people are so used to being interviewed by people who don't know shit about them. Yeah. And the more famous you get, the more you deal with that. I mean, I've definitely like been able to utilize that dynamic a lot on this podcast, in the sense that like, I'm genuinely interested in like, you know, the ninth most popular person associated with Dipset. So therefore,
right.
you know, I did an interview with fucking Duke the God and Hell Rell and stuff, where I just went to their apartment in Harlem, and that was just the best because I knew so much shit about these dudes and they loved it. But then like we all got way too drunk. Well, specifically they got too drunk, and like I have it recorded on my phone, but it just sounds crazy. By the end of it, we're talking about aliens and shit, and it's just it was a little out of control. Yeah, but I mean that was like to go into that environment and be able to be like, no, like Hell Rell, like you matter a lot.
Yeah,
that was like the best. And like I can see that with DOC too. Like he's such an interesting story. Like the people who don't know, and you should know, he basically like got into a car accident that completely obliterated his fucking throat, and he was never able to rap again. So it was sort of one of the first of many sad stories associated with that whole empire and its crumbling.
My favorite interview for sure for the book.
Really,
absolutely,
that's amazing.
Absolutely, especially with the accident and hearing him tell this story of like, you know, if these cops like weren't like starstruck, like he would actually have not even been in the accident. Like if they didn't sit there and pose for pictures with him and then be like, okay, just go. Yeah. You know, like be careful. Like
it seems like those cops should probably be in jail.
Possibly,
at least if it happened then.
Because he should have been in jail that night.
Right.
Like, for how he was
well, so
driving.
basically right before the accident where he almost killed himself or whatever, he gets pulled over by the cops, and then the cops realize it's him, take photos with him, let him keep driving, boom, then he almost... It's a fucked up scenario. Those cops, like, if they wanted to be cool about it, they could have maybe like took him home or something, you know, not
or drunk tank, you know.
Not.
He was high as fuck too, so there's that.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Ah, man. Yeah, like, do you feel like when you think about the whole censorship conversation that kind of was that's really one of the biggest contributions to that NWA had to the world at that time, and what took them to a huge level was just the fact that they were saying things, and then you know the GOP and not even just them, because the Democrats, everybody was just reacting in absolute horror to a lot of the stuff that they were saying at the time, and it really cracked open this whole debate about, you know, what's okay to say in the public sphere as a rapper or as any kind of famous person, whatever. What's crazy is now it just seems like that conversation has mutated into a lot of different directions, but you very rarely see rappers attacked for their lyrics anymore.
Right.
And also the lyrics are largely not nearly as offensive as they were at that time, at least with NWA. Is that something that stood out a lot? Just that this is a very different conversation about censorship these days?
It was, yeah. I mean, just how comical all of it was, where it was just... You know, the thing with Fuck the Police when it became on the radar for the FBI is like, and I talked about it in the book, was sort of this like whisper campaign almost that happened with like law enforcement, where they're actually faxing the lyrics to one another. Nobody's listening to the record at all. It's just like, look at these words. Right. And it's like, look at these, you know, look at these dudes, and they're black and they're saying all this shit about us. And it's just so much outrage, and like, they're all about it, but like nobody's actually listening to it. And so to see it go from this thing of different law enforcement agencies faxing it to each other, to FBI sending letter, to this whole chain of events that happened, like was actually laughable when you're thinking about it, you know. It really even came back to like, you know, when later, a couple years later, when, you know, Cube did No Vaseline, and like he's being interviewed, and they're like, well, what if somebody kills a Jewish person because of your music? And he's like, well, why would anybody do that? And it's like the whole thing is like funny, but then you also think about it where it's like, you know, rock music wasn't getting any of that. And it's like, you have to look at the fact that it was happening to them specifically because they were black men, and specifically because they were from the hood rapping about hood shit. And like, so therefore it was such a danger, you know. And then and at that point, when it's this huge controversy, their audiences are already primarily white. So the whole thing was really strange when you go back and look at it. And there's all these videos of like, you know, this just outrage of people, and they're stomping on the CDs and stuff. And it's just like, y'all are this bent out of shape about like music. And then you'll have a reporter ask them like, oh, well, did you listen to what do you think of it? Oh, I haven't heard it, but I read those lyrics. And it's like, you ain't even listened to it. Yeah. But you know, that just shows you just the level of like outrage. And we do see some of that now. Some of it's a little bit different, because I think now in terms of, you know, this public outrage that happens, there's this thing of like, well, let's end their whole career. Like, let's just do that. We don't like, we got to drop them from this endorsement deal or for this or for that. Like, that happens a lot. Now, we've seen some of that. Like Lil Wayne went through that. You know, a couple of guys went through that with, you know, brands. And I did a story on this years ago where I'm like even asking them like, well, did you listen to the music before you signed them? And it's like, oh no. And it's like, You basically just signed them because they're just popular, but you never did any research. Like there was nothing on your own part. So it's interesting now where I think the conversation, while it is different because there's not this huge outrage in terms of like, let's try to stop them from doing shows or things like that happens, even though we do see some of that like college campuses and things like that. It wasn't what they've gone through, which is like, let's try to block them from doing this or, threaten them with like, you're going to be arrested for this. And like, there was no crime ever committed. There's no crime in saying fuck the police, except for maybe just saying it to their face.
Yeah. Like fuck the police. Like we are now have a really hard time understanding how saying fuck the police in a song could really be considered offensive. But then when I went to talk about earlier about the offensive stuff in the music, I go straight to him shooting the trans person in the dick. It's very easy for us to understand how that's offensive now because, we just take it for granted that the police have power. So if you insult someone with power, it's not nearly as, and you shoot a bank teller in the penis, which I'm assuming never happened. That's, it just seems sadistic and horrible because you're clearly rapping about and bragging about like taking, violent acts against somebody who probably already has a somewhat hard life. That stuff seems horrifying to us. Whereas, a criticism of the police, that seems like everybody's kind of come around that like, that's an okay thing to have in a rap song.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what was I going to say? There's, another thing that stood out to me like crazy too was, the scene that you describe where they're performing and they had been on this whole tour, NWA, and they hadn't played Fuck the Police on the entire tour, and they finally decide to go for it. You could probably film a lot more of the details, but then all of a sudden there's armed cops and everything all over the building, and they're all like in plain clothes, and then they all storm the stage.
Storm the stage with firecrackers, like the whole thing, doing way too much, like to prove a point almost, which is we are the authority and you can't say these things about us on a record. There will be consequences.
Right. Which is weird. That's like all of a sudden we're like looking at the cops like, oh, you guys are kind of just a regular old gang. You just came here to set these guys
really
up.
Gang shit though, really, yeah.
Yeah, that's just like a scary sight. Did you was there video of that concert in which the cops sort of stormed the stage?
There's no video of that. That whole retelling of what happened I got from DLC.
Really?
Because I'm like, you're there, walk me through all of it. And it's still, he remembers it so vividly because he's just like, we didn't think we were going to do it. He's like, but we got to do it. This tour is almost over. Like, they had fans clowning them like in the lobby. Like, so y'all like not doing it? Because it had became a story already. It was already kind of a little bit of a nationwide story about this song and the blowback from the FBI and whether or not they're going to do this on the show, on the tour or whatever. So they were already hearing people that's like, well, if you're not going to do it, like, don't even come, So they just felt like we got to. This is the last show, yada yada, and we know what happens next.
Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah, I remember, like a funny thing that came out of obviously this is in your book or whatever, but that came out of that whole thing is I think at a certain point the Republican congressmen or lawmakers or whatever, they started to realize, well, this is really starting to look like we're just picking on black people. So maybe we should find some white art to focus in on too.
Maybe.
But they basically made the most like famous death metal band of all time because they decided to throw Cannibal Corpse in there. Which is hilarious to me because Cannibal Corpse, if anything, if you look at their lyrics, they're just as clearly satirical and fantasy as NWA, the mutilated corpses and all this crazy stuff that like in 1992, me as a second grader or third grader, as I found out about that shit was through the news or whatever. It seemed very shocking and appealing, but it's kind of hilarious to imagine being like Bob Dole and actually being offended by like a bloody Cannibal Corpse album cover. But that was their version of going like, we're going to go find some white media that's also offensive.
But it was even crazy because that like legally at a show they could show a mutilated head on stage, but you couldn't simulate sex on stage. That was a crime. So these things were happening. Like rock bands were doing, like Guar at the time was like on tour at the same time that they were, and like they were doing it, and then like LL Cool J's humping a couch, and then it's like, oh, you're getting arrested,
right? And then
like it's like
trouble.
Like for real and like actual trouble. So it's all of it is, looking back on it, is still, to me, was probably one of the more wilder things because it just seems so outrageous now.
Right.
But when you go back and you read the clips and you watch it, and it's like, y'all were really mad about this. Y'all were so upset.
It's just so strange to imagine now, like taking rap lyrics that literally, like, I was just thinking about 21 Savage, I got 1, 2, 3, 4 shooters ready to gun you down. And nobody's really like, oh, like that's a worrisome dumb thought that he has all these gunmen around him. Like, nobody's really too concerned about that. He's basically threatening you with murder, anyone, really, whoever he's speaking to. And then that is just, it goes completely under discussed because we all get it at this point that it's rap music is fun, boastful stuff. And, you know,
see, now it's fun and it's boastful. And then when someone's in trouble, it's like, oh, so they actually did criminal activity that they rapped about? I didn't know. Yeah. You know, we do this now where it's like, it's very weird where it's sort of examined after the fact, it seems.
Yeah. I mean, you just wrote a big article about XXXTentacion, who in many ways came up off of his appearance on the show. It was kind of, I'm assuming you watched it during
I watched the whole thing. I did.
Yeah. That was a weird thing to think about now. I was a few years ago just interviewing some random kid, and then he became the most polarizing superstar I can imagine out of all that. But, I mean, with somebody like him, you kind of look at it now where he's certainly, you know, not in the bucket of people who could get, you know, a Monster Energy deal.
Right. Yeah.
You know, that's the way that dudes are censored now, is that they have certain opportunities taken away from them and stuff. But does that seem strange, like writing about somebody like him who in the current situation is kind of, I'm going to give it to him, he's probably the closest thing to NWA in a lot of ways because he's, oh, we get this weird notification. No, remind me later. He's, you know, in terms of just being extremely controversial, having bad conduct and, you know, content in his music that is like very, very controversial. Like, do you see those parallels? And was that strange for you, like after the book, to be writing about somebody like him?
Yeah, it was really strange because, you know, it's hard because I struggle with this idea of, you know, how far do you separate the art from the artist? You know, and I go back to thinking like Chris Brown, for instance, because he was sort of kind of the only recent case of like, we still do this with him. We still hang this thing over his head, you know, whenever he comes out with something. And so
he kind of reminds us.
And he reminds us too, right? He does a good job of staying in a little bit.
He never lets you forget.
You know, he doesn't always stay clean. So I think with X, it was difficult because, you know, this story started actually as I had listened to the album, loved the album, wanted to do something about the kid. I didn't know anything about what was going on with him. You do a Google search, it's not that it's hard to miss any.
As a journalist, all of a sudden it's a totally different thing.
Like it's very hard. So then it becomes this idea of like, okay, so this stuff is happening, you know, and he's getting deals, he's getting these looks. Is it okay? You know, right now we are having a conversation about that. We are having a conversation about if men can continue to be rewarded artistically for things and when their personal life is not so clean. So it was tough trying to tell this story of not necessarily what he's done, but the conversation around what he's done as he's rising. Especially, and that was a really tough story to tell, especially because he's not gonna talk.
And it hasn't been settled in court. It hasn't been settled in
court. So, you know, there's all these different things going against you, but then he is also not someone who's laying low as he has this case coming up, like at all. It's like 1 week I'm like, okay, the story's done. And it's like, oh, you're getting jumped and it's on Instagram or, you know, you're saying these things about the case and like, you should probably take this way more serious than you are. And it's something where it's public record. So I just am sort of kind of like, why is there no one telling you like, you've got to just chill. Right. You know what I mean? Because you look up the case is not good. Like it doesn't look good for the kid. And so it was really tough because you're trying to write about this album, but you can't do that without looking at some of this other stuff because there's a song named after her. There's a situation where the young girl killed herself in the hotel room. Like, what the hell is that even about? You know, and there's all these mysteries around him, which is also makes him a little bit more appealing as well, which is why I do think that some of the popularity is what it is, especially on Twitter and stuff, is because there's such a mystery around, you know, him and the personality and like what he says and what he does. And so it was a really interesting story to write and research. Again, it was one of those things where I'm doing it strictly off of public record, you know, because you're not going to get to him. You know, that just was part of the story from the beginning, is like, he's probably not going to do it. And you have to be fair. And
I had him on my live stream like few months back, and I kind of tried to talk to him about all that. And it's like he's the kind of dude he's hearing his own questions,
right?
He's not really like, there's a lot of Kanye interviews from a few years ago that are like that too. Like you can ask him whatever you want. It's not necessarily.
Your interview with him was really, watching it where it's like I wasn't seeing someone who really understood the severity of the things that he is bragging about.
Right.
And so it's something where it's like, shit, we live in this culture now where it all comes back and bites you very quickly. So it was something where it was like only a matter of time before you got to go back and you remember this and he said this and this and this. So.
And John Caramonica had a really good piece in the Times the other day where he's sort of talking about how in rap, we're seeing almost like the total opposite effect of like, the Me Too movement and everything this year. All of a sudden, we've got, all these actors being removed from TV shows and stuff. Meanwhile, in rap, if you look at like the most popular up and coming rappers this year, pretty much all of them have really
serious cases
associated with them. And that in rap music, it's like, it's weird because, when what's his name from House of Cards gets removed, he can't really go and just make his own show to remain popular. Whereas like X, if he gets dropped by his label tomorrow, if Tekashi 6ix9ine gets dropped, if World Star decides they don't want to fuck with him anymore, it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
And so we exist in such a different system. And I mean, I think to a lot of people, especially more social justice type people, it's kind of frustrating because they're seeing rap as being like one of these last places where these sort of vulgar things and actions are being accepted. And it's because like we've entered into this world where the fans are really the ones calling the shots.
They're calling the shots. And, and I think too, the conversation with these guys is, it's crimes against women and, and hip hop for as long as it's been around, it's always sort of been accepted, to say these things. Even you think about NWA and a lot of what they got it wasn't just like, oh, bitch, ho this. It was like killing women in songs, which is like, okay, you can't. But then you also think of someone like Eminem who has remained unscathed, and maybe it's because he's not getting in actual real trouble in real life. And so you just overlook some of the lyrics. I don't know what it is always. And so the story was trying to examine the fact that also exists and also ask the question of, not necessarily if he should be able to get a $6 million, distribution deal. Like, I don't really think that is any of our places to say because it's not our money. But what does bother me is when these labels do it and then they don't say anything either in support or they just say nothing. They just pretend. You talk to CMG, no one wants to talk about it. They all want to pretend like they don't want to just associate or anything. So that does bother me a little bit because you are profiting off of every move he makes musically, and we do see this. We saw Bobby Shmurda. We've seen it time and time again where these guys do get these huge deals and then the labels are like, oh, you're in real trouble, let's just turn our backs. Versus the 90s where, when stuff was going down with Tupac and you got Suge like on TV, that's like, we getting them out, it's like, it's a whole different thing now.
Yeah, it's crazy, especially because I feel like most of the time the criticism towards dudes comes from outside of like the real culture, the real hip hop publications. Like that X article wasn't in XXL. No, it was in Pitchfork. Pitchfork is the one who went and did that. And I mean, we would typically consider Pitchfork like a non-rap specific white publication, and that's what's interesting is I think it's really frustrating to a lot of people on the left that the rap world seems like they just don't want to have these conversations. And the labels function the same way. The labels say, hey man, like the fucking fans don't care. And if we don't give them 6 million, then somebody else is going to. So here we are.
Yeah. I mean, even with the X piece where it's like, this is coming out in this climate right now. And a lot of people are writing about it. And like no hip hop writer, like, mention anything. There was no pick, Jezebel picks it up, so it's interesting to see.
Yeah, it's crazy. Do you think that, like, are you even able to imagine a situation in which the labels would be like so publicly shamed that they wouldn't sign certain people? I'm not really able to. Seems like the free market kind of rules in hip hop, at least for the time being.
I think so. I agree with you about, that's where we are now. I do go back to that, Bobby Shmurda case just because it is a time where the blowback was so loud, where you have like L.A. Reid, and I think maybe it's because he is a black label head that's like, so you're not going to do nothing, you're not going to say anything or nothing. And it's like, oh, well, that's not how the label is set up where we're going to like bail him out. That's not realistic. So it took it took all this public outcry to be like, so you just signed this dude, like knowing that he is involved with this stuff, and now that he's in trouble for what he's involved with and rapping about, you're going to turn your back. So they had to say something. But I think I think we're still going to see labels act the way that they are right now with X, which is like, well, we signed them, but like, let's just like wait and see like the court. Let the court figure it out. Let the court figure it out.
Yeah. And it's weird too when you think about somebody like Lil Reese, who, you know, got signed by Interscope, then a video comes out of him beating up a girl, boom, his career is just frozen. They're never going to let him put anything out. They're never going to let him out of that contract. That's really kind of fucked up too. I had that conversation with a lot of people in the music industry, just like, you know, regardless of him hitting that girl, like the way that they did him, where they made it so that he couldn't even come and try to do his own thing. I mean, that's fucked up too, you know? I don't know. That's sort of weird situation. Yeah, I'm in a weird position too, because it's like at times I feel like I want to be more explicit about like, oh, I don't agree with so-and-so's actions, whatever. But then at the same time, I feel like I've kind of worked my way into this place where I'm kind of just trying to be an advocate for the artist part of it. And then if they end up fucking up, like with X, it's like we did that interview. And then when I did speak to him on stream, I tried to bring up the allegations and everything, but it was kind of like, you know, it didn't seem like he was interested in talking to it. I didn't want to have the kind of conversation in that second interview where I really like held him to the fire. And you know, it's a weird position you put yourself in. And then, you know, somebody like Academics is like kind of out here, and he's sort of ended up in the same position I'm in a lot of ways, where he's becomes friends with these dudes early on, and then these accusations come out, and it's kind of like, well, now I'm in a odd predicament.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know. What I wanted to have that conversation before we like reach the end of this, is basically, what are your attitudes towards young kids, people who maybe are later into high school or college or whatever, and they want to do what you're doing. They want to write books. They want to cover the culture through writing. I would just like to have that kind of conversation, sort of speak to them a little bit. Yeah. Since you're doing the impossible.
It's quite impossible, it seems.
Yes. Like, do you deal with a lot of those emails? Or what's the kind of advice that you give out?
I always try to, any student that ever reaches out, I always hit them back. I try, especially when it's like, you know, a question that's easily answered. Like, not the whole thing, like, what do I do? I'm like graduating and I haven't had an internship. I literally write them back and just be like, don't do this. It's so hard, man. And especially, you know, we have interns coming through our doors who they've been at 8 or 9 different publications. And it's like, well, college is only 4 years. Like, how the hell did you find time for that? But that's the hustle, and you have to constantly hustle. And I think that's something that a lot of younger writers, at least that I encounter, most of them don't want to do it. You know, you start talking to them about all the different things you do, and you just look at you like, oh, okay. You know, they're waiting for you to finally be like, okay, and so then this is when I met Kanye. Like, they want to hear that. They want to be like, okay, I'm going to be around these guys as soon as I'm out of college doing it. And it's such a long road if you really want to do it at a certain level. But it's also, too, really interesting because anybody can do it. You know what I'm saying? So it's something where if you've got the discipline, like, you could be blogging right now, like, between classes, and like get those looks, and, you know, talk to, you know, get on Twitter and do all those different things that like a lot of these cats are doing. And it's like, they're going to be at the same spots that I'm at. So, you know, it just is all about like how hard you're willing to work is really what it boils down to. And like, I've tried to tell students in 100 different ways, but it always does come right back to that, is like, are you going to hustle? You know, are you going to really be dedicated to like learning as much as you can about the craft, but also learning as much as you can about the industry, because that also does matter a huge deal. You know, you have to have some kind of reference point. And I've gotten that question a lot, because they'll be like, oh, well, you're 30 writing a book about NWA. Like, well, what? And it's like, you still know what came before. You know, if you're a rap fan, you know, if you're a fan of anything, you become a student of it. You know, and I've always been taught that. I was taught that in J school, and like, that's just what I've applied to like writing about music, because I was a fan first before I was able to do this. And so I come from that mentality of like, I've consumed all this stuff for years anyways. So now it's just connecting the dots of a lot of different things.
Yeah, like a lot of people want to be a writer, but then they don't want to, you know, wake up 2 hours early and sit in front of their laptop with their phone in the other corner of the room and actually work on their writing. I figured that out myself. I figured out like, man, I'm not fit for this writing thing. I think I want to talk on camera, but I think I might be better at that. Yeah. But I mean, that's a big part of it. And then I think, the other part, like you're saying, is like me getting into the podcast thing ultimately was just the result of me paying attention to the culture for my whole life. And at a certain point realizing like, you know what, I think I might actually be capable of like having some of these conversations publicly. And, I mean, I feel for kids that way too. And especially because I think now more than ever, if you want to be a writer and let's say that you're capable of being funny on Twitter, setting up a fucking Medium account or a Tumblr or whatever the fuck people are doing these days and just writing stuff. It's like, if you actually are talented, a lot of times people might be looking in and think like, oh, well, he's just friends with this person, or this person they just went and like met this person and stuff. But if you really are talented, that shit just stands out like crazy as a writer,
You'll find it. You'll find the audience. I mean, I wasn't somebody who had a connect at the LA Times and got on. Like, I wasn't, I went there and literally started from the absolute bottom of that place and, doing cops in courts and like all the stuff where I'm like, I don't want to write about another murder or any fire, all this, like, it doesn't interest me. Like, I want to write about music eventually, but you just pay those dues. And like, that's something that I want, the young ones to always know that it doesn't change. You do see a lot of people get put on really quickly in writing where it's like, you look up and it's like, oh, this person's got like a book deal already. And like, all they do is like, write like essays and stuff like, and it gets weeded out so fast because this shit will break you. Like it really will, man. It really will. Yeah. Crazy.
Do you have any other books in the pipeline or anything? Like, what stands out to you after having written your first one? Like, has that changed the way that you look at your creative career and what you want to do with your time going forward?
It does. I mean, I want to jump back into it as soon as I can, even though I'm still trying to recover from writing this first one.
Is that how it feels? Like you were on like some kind of weird binge for a few months or a year?
I'm like so like disoriented, because just a lot of it is like, I don't know. I don't think there was a day where I like slept a normal hour for like 2 years straight. And so it does just affect you in these ways that you don't realize. And like after the fact, you're like, oh, I don't even like know the day of the week anymore. Like it got to a bad point. Smoked a lot of weed to get through it though, which was good. But it was like still.
Well, that's good to hear. That's very good to hear.
Yes.
In some ways, I think if I were to sit down and try to write a book, that like the weed might be what's stopping me from writing the book.
No, it actually did the complete opposite.
That's very good.
Like
to hear.
The complete opposite. But yeah, I mean, I would like to. If I do the book thing, though, I want it to be with an artist who wants to cooperate the entire time. And so there was a couple different things that just fell through because some artists, they want to write a book, but they don't want to write or really even participate in the process, which I just think is weird. Like, why would you have somebody like write this story about you and you don't want to actually like tell them things about you or like sit and talk with them? So there was a couple things that it just fell through just because it's like the agent is like, this doesn't work.
Yeah.
This isn't a good way to do it. So I'm like holding out a little bit. There's there's dreams that I want to do in sort of the book world. But then in terms of like, my actual day-to-day job, like it really helped me like understand sort of how I do write and how I can work and how I can work quicker. Like that helped. A lot, I now obviously I want to like do like bigger pieces where I'm like doing a little bit more research just because it's something that's like ingrained in me. And so like this X thing was like the first thing that I wrote this year, but it was a story that's been done for like 3 or 4 months. And having the time to do those kind of stories isn't something that you always get at a newspaper. So I would like to continue to do things like that as much as I can, but also the smaller stuff like I don't overthink it anymore. Having to do this where you have this word count over your head and this deadline, and it's like it's got to be turned in because they done gave you money and you done spent this shit already. Like it just changes a lot of things where it's like, all right, it makes you stay focused and it makes you understand like, all right, I got to turn this in.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because I probably should have asked this earlier, but you said you really enjoyed the research part. Is the writing the painful part?
There were parts of the writing that was painful. When I was able to just tell the stories, it was good. But then you have to think about the fact that you're not the only person that's going to read this. So what's interesting to you might not be interesting to somebody else. So to continue to have like a narrative thread was like the hardest thing, because you write a story and it's just the story. But a book is a million different stories, right? But it has to have a thread, and sometimes you go back to things. So there was like little different nuances of that I just wasn't aware of, you know, or there would be times I get the notes back from editor and he's like, well, you covered this particular part like 3 chapters back. So unless there's going to be more information, cut it. And you're like, oh, I thought I got a reminder. And he's like, stop reminding a reader, like as if they didn't read the shit 50 pages ago. They're going to remember. So there was things like that I just wasn't prepared for. And like, you just learn it as you go.
Yeah. Amazing. All right. Hey, where should people, well, I mean, you can head on over at Barnes & Noble or Amazon.com, I'm sure. But if they wanted to like really support you, is there anywhere you'd prefer that they go to get this thing?
Well, Amazon hit me with those reviews would be awesome.
The reviews,
that would be very awesome. That works out for me in ways I didn't know it did. But you know, any bookstore should have it in stock, which is awesome to know that as well. I went in Barnes & Noble the other day, just like looking around, and like my shit was at the front of the store.
That must have been nice,
like,
huh?
Uh-oh, it's like hip hop, man, at the front of the store at Barnes & Noble. It's like huge.
That's what's funny is that there's a good chance it's going to be there for like 10, 20 years too. You know, like a good, like realistically, nobody's going to stop listening to Dr. Dre, Eazy-E, Ice Cube, etc. So it's just you can kind of count on it that if you did a good job, that the book's going to be around for a long ass time. That's got to be a good feeling, a little legacy building.
Feeling. It's a weird feeling for sure.
Hey, well, second edition.
I hope so.
Man, I'm gonna say I noticed like one grammatical error in there.
Out there, just one.
You found a couple?
It was like stuff like commas that I was like,
right. There was one like word that I noticed out of place, and I just like read the sentence like 4 times, and I'm like, oh, I'm not gonna write this down so I don't feel tempted to tell them.
It's like that part was like brutal, and I'm reading Fire and Fury right now, and like you can see that, and then you can tell when they like rush it, and you're just like, oh no, like that's like I don't want that. I didn't want that.
You know, I was in Barnes & Noble the other day, and I thought about buying that, and I was just like, just telling myself in my head, I'm like, no, this is not directly related to what you're doing with your life. You could read a fucking summary on Politico, it's okay. And then I bought a Pimp C biography instead, and I'm like, this is gonna like affect your career in a more important way.
You know, that is true.
At the end of the day, it's like there's so much fun stuff you could read about why Donald Trump is the worst, but it's at a certain point it kind of becomes like porn, where no matter how much more of you take in, you're not making yourself a better person. Well, from your perspective, of course, you got to write about it and shit. It's important, but yeah. Hey man, it was good talking to you.
Yeah, man, it was a pleasure. This was fun. A lot of fun, man.
Thanks so much, and everybody go check this out. And his Twitter's on the screen. Make sure you throw him a follow. Go write a review on Amazon. Appreciate it, man.
Yeah, thank you, man.
Thank you, bro.
It's a pleasure. It's
Thanks.
fun.